right? I have to go back and look at Rancho Guadalasca, this Mexican era land grant. So this map is the original diseño. It's the original map that was associated with the petition for that. And so, I don't know if folks are familiar with Camarillo and the university, but this is Round Mountain. So this is, so the campus is right here, and a lot of times people see this lagoon, they think lagoon, but actually, historically, Callejas Creek, what is today Callejas Creek, ended at the campus. And so this was a freshwater wetland lagoon, which would have been valuable. And then behind here, right, we have the ridge. So here's La Jolla Valley, here's the beach, Punta de Mugu, Point Mugu, right, and then Sycamore Canyon. So the Rancho spread from Mugu Lagoon, right here, down to Sycamore Canyon, up Sycamore Canyon to Dos Vientos and the top of the grade, and then from the top of the grade, it angled down to Lewis Road in Camarillo, and from there, back to Mugu Lagoon. So it was over 30,000 acres. So, and here again, here's a modern day, roughly, boundary of that. So mostly mountainous, right, but with valleys, and then the plain, and most importantly, the fresh water on campus. So we are right here. But Rancho, it controlled most of Mugu Lagoon, was part of that territory. So I want to briefly mention the Chumash, right? The Chumash are the indigenous peoples of Ventura County. They're still here today, right, but no longer in control of their own lands. And most people who are familiar with the Chumash are familiar with them because of the islands or because of Santa Barbara, because the largest population density was in Santa Barbara. But I like to stress Muwu, which is Mugu, right? The Spanish changed the pronunciation and the spelling. Even though it was the largest village in the area, but it wasn't, as large as others, probably only several hundred people, maybe a maximum of 400 or 500. But they actually controlled the religious calendar from Malibu, which was Humaliwu, Malibu, all the way up to Santa Barbara. So even though we don't view it in many ways as being an important village, because it wasn't the largest, didn't have the most numbers of chiefs, the most canoes, it actually was very important religiously, and for that respect. And it's from this general area, right? I haven't shown you, but you can see the reason it became important, and many of the Chumash villages became important, was because of the beaches, the sandy beaches. Because the tomal, which was the plank canoe, was very important because that allowed them. They were basically cargo ships, and they allowed people to easily get across the channel, carrying a lot of people or a lot of goods. And so the Chumash and late prehistory really monopolized on that.
A lot of people from like shipping people in, or just as far as
well, transport, because you think about it, that I think this was the talk I gave 2 years ago. I talked about the history of the Chumash out on the islands. People have been out on the islands for at least 14,000 years. But ships, the boats changed over time, and it was very difficult. So chances are, if you were born out on the islands, you stayed out on the islands. You probably never made it to the mainland because it would be so difficult. A few people would. And we know they did because we find obsidian, volcanic glass, which comes from the desert. We find deer bone, and there's no deer on the island, right? Not until the 1800s when Anglo-Americans brought them. So we know there was contact and trade, but it probably wasn't very frequent because of that danger. But Hueneme is Chumash for boat, either sleeping place or rest place, because this was the shortest distance out to the islands. So people up and down the coast would come to Hueneme, and they'd spend the night, and they'd get up at, say, 4 o'clock in the morning, so they could get out to the islands before the winds picked up. Yeah. So, but this revolutionized these tamals because you could get up to 2 tons of cargo and up to 20 people. And so that promoted regular exchange, but then that also promoted wealth. So the archaeologists are really interested in the Chumash because they were hunter-gatherer fishers. They didn't grow crops, even though they knew about it. But they had a social inequality, they had status differences, and they had craft specialization and jobs. So you could be a canoe owner. It would take up to 6 months to make a canoe. And so they protected the knowledge of that. And then once you were a canoe owner, you could say, sure, take my canoe, go fishing, but I get 10% of your catch, or I get 20% of your catch, right? And so we think that's what was going on. People would make canoes, and then they transport people back and forth, or right? So yeah, I can give a whole talk on the Shumash, but I like to point that out because for me, it's Ventura County, even though I didn't move here until 2002, although I did some field work at Point Review State Park in grad school. But I love this area, and so the Shumash is part of the history, and I want to acknowledge, right, that the Shumash are still here today. And on campus, I should have mentioned Round Mountain, right? So again, this is Round Mountain. Samiwa, it was a Shumash shrine, solstice site, and they actually the plan was to reconsecrate it in December. So now it will be regularly used by the Shumash, right, for ceremonies. And we're improved the trail, so the trail will be open to the public for people to get up to the peak. So, and this is a map. So again, we're over here. Here's the lagoon and PCH, right? There's the campus up there. And so these are just different archaeological sites through time, but in the past, they tended to be more inland towards the mountains. And then more recently, they shifted to this region, the lagoon, but also the beach, right? And that's because of this invention of the canoe. We think the canoe was invented about 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. And so they shift the villages to those locations to kind of monopolize, especially at Point Magoo. This is roughly where we think Magoo was, somewhere in here. But here, ocean, plain, mountains, right? So it was at a juxtaposition of environments so they could get everything they needed. Okay. All right, so that's the Shumash. So Isabel Iorba was the first first grantee of the land grant. And so she was an amazing woman. I could have, again, spent the whole talk just talking about her. So we'll just do a couple minutes, but this is part of another reason I became interested in this, because she was illiterate. So we don't, actually, I say a whole hour, I can't talk about her directly because we have no letters for her, no diaries. So I found one letter that she purportedly wrote, but it's clearly, it's such fancy script, right? It was somebody, she dictated the letter to somebody else. Actually, it was to Abel Stearns, so I'm trying to get that translated. But so we only know secondhand information, and most of that comes from court cases, filings of land transactions and things like that. But the Yorba family, or as today we call it Yorba family, was a very large, right, important early family in Spanish California as well as the Mexican era. Her father, right, was first he was a volunteer, Catalan volunteer in Spain, came to the New World. He was part of one of the de Portola's expeditions. He served the Presidios in Monterey and San Diego, right? And then he was married twice, as frequently happened, right? His first wife died after, I don't know if it was a childbirth, but it was after their third child. And then he married his second wife, and then she had 13 kids.
Oh my God.
Isabel Yorba, I think, was the fourth, but the first girl in the family. And she was your typical, right, Californio, right, there were no schools, right? It was really difficult, and so in particular, girls weren't educated, but although frequently they were called the smart ones, right? They were the clever ones. And so she married at 16, because that's what you do. So she married a cadet in San Diego. She gave birth to a daughter the next year, and they moved to Santa Barbara, to the Presidio, where she spent the rest of her life. But life is difficult, right? Her daughter died at the age of 11 in 1818. Her sister, actually, a younger sister, came and moved there and died in childbirth, I think in the early 1820s. Her husband died in 1830. Oh, sorry, I took out that slide. Okay. I was trying to limit the time. But her husband was a studying contradictions. So apparently he was an excellent soldier, excellent supervisor. By the end of his career, he was acting commandant at the Presidio in Santa Barbara. But he was also known to be a drunk and run up huge debts. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen pictures from women in the early 1800s, but the big tortoiseshell combs, right? So they found one of the few records we have. Ship's captain, American ship captain, was in Peru, came and sold 4 tortoiseshell combs. Today's value would have been $600 each, right? And who bought them? De la Guerra, right? A couple other guys, and Madrina, her husband, right? So he liked to spend things, but apparently he was known to beat his wife and to be a drunk. So he retires, he is elected to the Mexican Congress in 1828, goes to Mexico, and he dies there from being a drunkard, right? Organ failure, all that kind of stuff. So by 1830, she is alone. She's now 40, or her early 40s. She was born in 1789. So the reason I really like her and her history, because she was born, right, a Spanish citizen, Mexican citizen, American citizen, right? So, and then, but what does she do? Right, she's also very religious, really believes in her role. I mean, so you can say what you want about the Spanish and their treatment of the Chumash, right, which in many ways was horrible, but she was a firm believer, right, in this lifestyle. So you look at the Spanish records and the mission records, and she was sponsor to numerous Chumash neophytes, as well as children of friends and other, California families. So she was a godmother to at least 12 people, right? And so she took that seriously, as well as giving her goods to the friars. She always gave part of her tallow and other goods to the mission. She would send sweets, baskets to the priests at Christmas time, things like that. And she adopted formally at least 4 young women, right? And some of them whom already had kids. So they became her heirs, right? So in addition to always having helping in the religious aspect, she actually had individuals that she was formally and legally responsible for. Include some of these women here. And there's been different spellings. Refugia was probably Rugia, different spellings, people, but those are some of them. And so what does she do in 1836? She petitions the Mexican governor for a ranch, saying, my father did wonderful service, my husband did wonderful service, I'm now, the mother of numerous children, I have 500 cattle that keep getting loose and I have nowhere to put them, right? And she's able to play on her family, in that way. And I failed to mention fully, the Yorba family, another reason they're famous, her father and at least 3 brothers were granted land grants, including what is today Yorba Linda. So Yorba Linda is named for her brother, Bernardo. He was the most famous one. But basically they controlled the whole Santa Ana River from Newport Beach all the way to the Riverside County line. That's the Yorba family. So she petitions, right? Here's the diseño. Now we have her cattle brand, right? I love it with the Y. And this is the ear tags, right? They would cut ear tags for cattle. Because for those of you who might not be from the region, in this time period, they would just let the cattle roam free. And that's where the term rodeo comes from. Once or twice a year, they'd gather all the cattle. They'd know whose was whose, right? And then they'd send those, they wouldn't kill those or do things with that because that was their neighbors. So she petitions in 1836, and the head priest at San Buenaventura says, oh no, you can't give her that land. We need that for our cattle because of the lagoon. She petitioned again in 1837 because they awarded Rancho Guadalasca to her except for the parcel at Round Mountain with the lagoon. And she petitioned, oh no, I have to have that for my cattle, my family is starving, and da-da-da-da. And said, okay. So success in 1837 where she got both parcels, right?
Was that a pathway that I saw on the slide before?
Pathway?
Or is it a symbol? What is
This?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's the brand.
That's
the cattle brand. So that's her brand, the Yorba.
What about below it? Is that also a brand?
That's the ear tag.
That's the
So what they do,
got
they would take scissors or knife and cut the ears.
Yeah. So both the ear and the
Yeah.
is a tag, and they were always individual to whoever owned them.
Right. If they would register it, yeah. So I don't know when she started using this brand, but it was registered in 1869. But at least by then, that was her brand. So success. And there was a court case in the 1850s. So we have a lot of this recorded. So within a year, she does what she's supposed to do, right? In order, it's kind of like the Homesteading Act in the United States. They had to actually live on the property. She built a fence for the horses, right? They had an adobe. And so apparently she had 40 horses and 500 head of cattle there. I've heard different stories about whether or not she really truly lived there. Now she was supposed to in order to maintain the grant. The court case made it sound like she was actually at least a good chunk of the year there up into the early 1850s. So like summertime, you're at the ranch, and wintertime, you're back up in the comfort of Santa Barbara.
So you jump a bit.
Yeah.
Transition from the Mexican possession to the American possession, what changes with land titles?
Right.
And they carry the grant forward? or-
Good question, sorry I didn't get to that because I was trying to shorten it. In the Spanish period, very few individuals had grants. It was all the missions, right? It was the mission system. And there were a few people who, because of service to the crown, were given land. But in the Spanish period, they wanted all the villages and the towns basically associated with the missions. And with the Mexican period, right, then the Mexican period opened up the land, right, to giving it to people, which is, unfortunate because the whole point was in the missions that they promised the land to the indigenous peoples, right, once they adopted the Spanish way of life. They're like, you're gonna be good citizens and you're gonna get land. So they reneged on that, right, when it became the Mexican period. Many groups didn't get the land, right, and they ended up serving the Mexican landowners just like they did serve the missions. So probably a good chunk of Isabel Yorba's ranch hands were Chumash, right? But again, I don't know that for sure. Definitely, there's an 1850 census that says Mexican and Chumash workers.
What about under the United States? She keep her land?
I'm getting to that. Yes, yes, exactly. So again, no direct records to her ranch, to the ranching life, except for these court cases and a few other agreements. Sometimes people would do legal, just like with notarizing, they would record things legally so they have a record. So her first Mayordomo ranch foreman was Bernardino Lugo. So he was the one that was there the longest, so we have record of that. Leyva, there's a record saying 1854. He's going to do all these things. These are his jobs. But his job is not guaranteed if their court case with the federal government fails, right? So starting when Alta California became part of the United States, everybody had to petition to have their land grants approved. That's another sad history in our United States of all the Californians who lost their property. And even she had to fight for years in order to get it approved, even though it was clearly, right, she was active in it and it grew and do all this kind of stuff. Dominique, I don't know how you pronounce it, Domingo Abide, he was French, right? And so he married one of the daughters, and these other two guys married some of the daughters, right? So there's all this interconnectedness with the families, so each one. And then there's another gentleman, Bonilla, who served in 1868. He was her foreman, and I don't have time to go into it today, but that's an interesting triangle. Her foreman got in an argument with Abide over how to handle the ranch. He came back to argue with them. The foreman's son was sent to Santa Barbara to Isabel and said, how do you want us to run the ranch, right? I'm your foreman, this is what you told me to do. Now your son-in-law is telling me I can't do what I'm doing. He had the son thrown in jail. And then 2 or 3 months later, Abide came back to the ranch, fight ensues. The son kills Abide and takes off to the hills. His father, a month later, brings him into Santa Barbara for trial because the assumption is it's self-defense, everything will be good. 11 of 12 jurors don't speak Spanish. He's convicted of murder at the age of 18, sentenced to hang. And 6 days before his hanging, the letter writing campaign worked, and it was reduced to life in prison. So the judge, 200 people in Santa Barbara, the Mexican consul all wrote in saying he's a good kid, he's only 18, And actually, I found evidence recently. He was released after 17 years in prison in San Quentin. So that's another whole interesting side story because of the racism against Californios. But that also relates, I think, to the Isabel having to fight her title, right? So the lawsuits were denied. I think I have that here. The lawsuits were denied. They had to go back, and then one guy just said there's no proof of she ever did anything at the ranch. And you're looking at the court transcript saying, but the foreman was there, and he talked about everything that she did. It's written down, and yet this one judge is saying, oh, no evidence. She appealed, and she eventually won.
It was written down.
Mm-hmm, exactly. So by 1855, 1856, it's approved, but it's not patented by the federal government. So it's still not official. So for another 13 years, 14 years, it's still not official that it's her property. Yeah, here we go. And just briefly, I talked about all this other stuff already, except for this one, shows you what an interesting person she must have been, a good member of society. She redid her adobe, right, in the more modern style, and the city of Santa Barbara rented out a room for their city council meetings, right? So she's, she was just part of the social elite. And I wish more people knew about her. I've been lobbying to get a couple buildings named after her on campus, a building on campus, right? Guadalasca or Yorba, in addition to Satwewa for the Shumash. Yeah, so again, very few records, right? This was a record for payment to her, right? So $15 a month in order to use her Adobe. Her Adobe was damaged in the earthquake in 1913, 14, yeah. So,
25, I'm sorry.
well, I know there was a big one in 25, but I think there was a smaller one earlier. That's why I get my dates
Sorry.
confused. Okay. But, yeah, so there were issues with the boundaries of the land grant. Sorry, I always yell at me from the way. You guys can't see. One with the land grant in particular, right? And then there's issues with the boundaries. Because of the way things are recorded. So there's an issue with this western boundary coming down to Point Lagoon. And there's a difference between this boundary and this boundary because she sold it to her nephew for $1. One of Bernardo's sons in 1868. And then in 1871, he turns around and sells it to these guys. And an American attorney then argues, and he was her attorney, but he's arguing after her death, oh, no. She was illiterate, she was stupid, she didn't know what she was talking about. She didn't sell him a third of the ranch, she only sold him a quarter of the ranch. And so, unfortunately, then it got shifted. His version worked, and so this border actually shifted up. So this is, for those of you who might know the area, this is Potrero Road, right here. Here's today's Potrero. Used to go through this way, right? But then when the hospital came in, they shifted it that way. So that's a pesky issue. Let me see. But anyway, so she's hanging on, right? I mean, she got the Rancho in the 1830s when she's in her early 40s. So it's the end of her life. It's 1871. It still hasn't been formally patented by the federal government. She was probably ill, and so she sells. So in 1868, she sold the northern third/quarter to her nephew for $1, which was 8,200 acres. The southern portion was 23,000 acres, and so she sold it in 1871 for $22,000 in gold coins. I mean, she made a profit because actually the year before her total assets were put at $14,000. So she, again, I think was very shrewd. Yeah, she cashed out for her heirs. And then she died a month later. Yeah. So it was formally patented, it says 1873, and I think January of 1873, President Grant, right, signed off on it because they had to officially go through that executive and congressional areas. So, but I think this is why she's amazing, right? She's illiterate, right? And she's had such a horrible, hard life, but yet she managed to hold on to it and then successfully handed it over to her heirs. Mm-hmm. So the gold went to everybody, to the 4 adopted children, and the 2 of them, Refugio Lugo de Abade and Isabel Dominguez, right, got the house. And Abade, her husband is the one who was killed by the ranch foreman's son, right? And the granddaughter married Alexander Harmer, who was famous for setting up the Santa Barbara style art. So he was famous for doing an art colony. So her house actually was the center of art, the art world in Santa Barbara in the late 1890s and early teens. So today it's known as the Yorba or Abade Harmer house, right? I mean, again, it's been destroyed, but we hear reference to it. So anyway, so that's Isabel Yorba in a nutshell.
Dynamic.
Yeah, she does look very dynamic. That's why I need to brush up on my Spanish and find other letters, right? Because, so for example, I found a letter by her husband written in 1816, 1817. He had horrible handwriting. And I can just pick out Isabel. And I'm like, oh, what are you saying about your wife? It was written to their good friend and his boss, right? One of them. So.
What if you could scan it and
Yeah,
image
no, I
it
took
and
pictures
translate
and I send it to people that I know who speak Spanish. So, all right, I went on longer than I intended. But that's kind of the background history why I think Rancho Guadalasca is so interesting. But I'm now going to switch the focus to the northern portion because that's where Cal State Channel Islands is located. Right? So again, these were the pesky boundaries. And for those of you, want to get a better feel for what Rancho Guadalasca is, I should have shown this earlier. This is a better one. Here's Sycamore Canyon, right? So Sycamore Canyon to Point Wigoo. And up here, this is Dos Vientos today. Which I'd like to show, you know. Every time I'm like, oh, Rancho Conejo, and I'm like, Rancho Guadalasca was up there too. It's not just that. Okay. So southern portion, she sells to Dickerson, Funk and Dickerson. Dickerson and Funk. They get foreclosed on. I mean, it must have been, it makes you wonder about banks or what's going on. That they get $25,000 in gold, and then within 2 years, 3 years, they get foreclosed on because they, I guess, didn't make their payments. Everybody today talks about how William Richard Broome bought that property. But I found Santa Barbara newspaper articles that he at least had at least one partner named Jacques, because there were references to the, and I'm blanking on his name right now, but him and his wife, and they went to Guadalasca, right? So, you know, because everything's in the newspapers back in those days, you know, so-and-so went to Ventura to visit her sister, right? It's all in the papers. And so there's reference to that they actually went and lived on Rancho Guadalasca part-time. So Broome lived in Santa Barbara, right, as did his partner. But at some point, I'm still tracing that back, at some point that partnership was dissolved and it went to just William Broome and his family, and they still own it today. So with the former Mr. Broome, who just passed away about 10 years ago, he's the first generation where they lived on the ranch year-round. Up until then, they were absentee owners, and he had to fight the government for ownership because they basically took the land for the military. So what's today the lagoon? I mean, they paid for it, but it was pretty clear, right? And he fought because they wanted to take all of it, and he quit his job. He was a pilot after World War I, and he quit his job to come back and fight for the family ranch, right? And they kept it. So it's that portion. So this part here is now the federal government, right? Most of this is now the federal government. And then this family sold the southern part to the state parks. So Point Mugu State Park, a good chunk of Point Mugu was Rancho Guadalasca, right? And they sold that. Okay, and then we get to Kalisher, and so those are the lower folks, and then Kalisher and Wartburg. So her nephew, 1868, gets the property. 3 years later, he sells. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But he sold it to Kalisher and Wartenberg, who are two Jewish businessmen from LA. And I was like, why do Jewish businessmen want a cattle ranch in Ventura County, or Santa Barbara County at the time? Tannery. They opened the first commercial tannery in Los Angeles. And they're famous in their own right. Kalisher for Indian rights, Wartenberg because he helped found the Jewish Boulevard Temple and the first firefighting organization in LA after the business burned. So then they sell, and I haven't quite figured it out, I'm still trying to trace it, but it looks like Wartenberg dies suddenly in the late 1870s, and so probate occurs, and so I think all their joint partnership stuff has to be sold off. And so then it is purchased, the northern portion is purchased by Louis Sloss and Louis Gersel, two Jewish businessmen from San Francisco who made it rich after the gold rush by selling goods. And they're famous for the Alaska Commercial Company, so a shipping company. They both died independently in the 1903. They both died within 6 months of each other. Their widows hold on to it for a few more years. They sell to Moises Wolf from Hueneme, Jewish businessman. And then 2 or 3 months later, he turns around and sells to Joseph Lewis. And so I'm still unclear if he was maybe just the middleman, right, for Lewis to get the property. And Lewis dies. We're going to talk about that.
Lewis Road's named after him.
Yes, and that was the next thing I was getting to. Right, so today that property is known as the Lewis Ranch. So the Lewis family is famous for bringing lima beans to the region. So his father, Henry Lewis, is the one who purportedly bought the lima beans off a ship, right? So it should be Lima, Peru, right? Lima beans off a ship. Joseph and his dad didn't get along. So it sounds like pretty quickly he moved down here to Ventura County, became partners with Camarillo and worked with him, and then it looks like got up the money to buy his own parcel of land. And so they're famous for bringing lima beans into mass production. Lewis apparently was an inventor. He invented his own equipment to harvest lima beans more efficiently, and he worked on the genetics to try to create positioning of the beans so they're easier to harvest and things like that, creating better varieties. And yeah, so the Lewis Ranch, they divided up, again, if you can think about the picture, if you're familiar with it. The lower ranch is what's today by campus off of Lewis Road, that's the flat land. And the upper ranch, if you see that big ridge, right, as you're driving up 101, the upper ranch was in those mountains in what is today Dos Vientos and the hillside. So the upper ranch, they did what was traditional. So I also like to talk about Rancho Guadalasca because it shows how land use changes in California. So up until the late 1880s, it's mostly cattle and sheep. And starting in the 1880s, because of all the droughts and the bad weather, they're shifting to row crops, also because land is opening up. They're breaking up the big ranchos. Small-scale farmers are coming in, and so they're growing things like lima beans, right? And Lewis Ranch did both. So they have row crops down in the flatlands. They were some of the first in the area to put in orchards. They purportedly have the largest walnut orchard here in this part of the county. And yeah, there's also sorts of lawsuits, right? Agor, as in Agora Hills, right? Sued Lewis because Agor's brother's sheep got into his crop. And Lewis is like, what are you telling him? Why? Because they had the lease under the previous owners, right? So there's all sorts of stuff going on. So actually there's a hillside on campus that on an old map says Agor Hill, and I'm trying to get them to change it to that name. Because they call it Peanut Hill. What? Chris is the historian in me, right? I just like celebrate people. So the top picture is a picture of the Lewis Ranch before 1926. And the bottom one, this isn't Lewis, but the ranch, but this is farming and ranches up in Conejo Valley, and I threw that in because, again, part of the ranch was Conejo Valley, right? So yeah, again, Lewis's were pretty important in the area. So in addition to that, they founded a bank in Camarillo, the Farmers Bank. If you go to Old Town, there's now a new building that they covered up, they uncovered the front, J.F. Lewis and Sons, 1916. So they built a bank, a confectionery, a department store, and an auto repair shop. And apparently it started out with him, that's where he put his, cars. So they were really, well-to-do folks in this neighborhood, but they also had lots of tragedies, right? He's estranged from his father. Apparently whenever he took the train, he'd duck down in his seat or cover the blinds because apparently his father's ranch was right along the train tracks. So he didn't want to be seen. One of his sons, Henry, was killed on a Christmas Day, probably drunk driving accident, like 2 o'clock in the morning, on what was the Bell Ranch, which is, so today, Camarillo Library and the Rancho Campana High School, if you're familiar with that area. Heard a noise, found the poor kid underneath the car, looks like he got suffocated by the car. Joseph and his housekeeper, and I think her name was Martinez, I couldn't find my notes this morning, are injured in a train crash because apparently Somis Road, which is now Lewis Road, when you would hit the Camarillo train tracks, there were these big oil or gas storage containers, and you could not see trains coming from Los Angeles. So apparently the 2 of them were injured in a train crash in 1916, and the next year his daughter-in-law, Lena Coelty, as in Coelty Road, Camarillo, was killed. So, and it looks like she knew the train was coming, so because they found her gearbox in reverse. So it looks like she got hung up on the tracks, tried to reverse, she was killed. Their 10-year-old son was thrown from the car but survived. And he stayed local, he married a Decker, as in Decker Road in Malibu. So lots of tragedy. And she was married to Guy, and poor Guy, who knows what was going on with him, right? Because within a year, he catches up with an old high school sweetheart who's like a wannabe actress in LA, and she's divorced, and within a week they're married. And then his brother Searles is engaged to her best friend, but then it turned out within a year, she likes to party, she likes to drink, she was known to hang out with Frank Camarillo, and so Guy tries to get divorced, and the courts are like, can't get divorced. So it was like the divorce trial of the century in LA and in Ventura County. And in LA, they think poor Dorothy is the one who's the victim, and in Ventura, it's poor Guy Lewis who's the victim because she's a gold digger, right, and all this kind of stuff. So originally the divorce is denied. He has to pay her alimony. Her best friend is on the stand going, yeah, she only married him for his money. because she wanted her fancy clothes. So finally, it is approved in 1921, and there's this great quote of him outside the courtroom going, "Oh, I just want to go back to the ranch. No more marriage for me." Maybe Alma Vale in 1922. I'm still trying to figure that one out. And then I found a divorce record, and Genevieve, and I think that's spelled wrong, but that's the way it was in the paper. It was a record of the divorce in the paper. Divorced in 1933 after 9 years of marriage. The guy got married at least 4 times. It's like, okay. So just like I guess many families, there's lots of things that occur. And so, but the poor Lewis family right then, Joseph, the patriarch, died suddenly in 1926, in his early 60s. Apparently it was a heart attack or heart condition. And they had put most of the family property into a corporation. So each of the kids he gave a parcel of land to, and if you drive along Lewis Road, those are the Lewis family houses. There are 2 little green 1-story houses and a 2-story cream one right at the curve. That was Guy's house that apparently he never lived in because it was being built when all that stuff was going on. But they lost it all at I think not the family homes, but all the property, mostly the 8,200 acres they lost at the start of the Great Depression, which gets us to, we'll head to the state hospital. So in the early 1930s, the mental illness, right, the mental ill population in California is growing. Also, though, at this time, I don't know if you guys were aware, people who are going to the mental hospitals aren't always mentally ill. They're drunks and drug addicts. And so they would be sent to Camarillo to dry out. And it makes you, I feel so bad for the folks then, right? And then they could be right back out on the streets and they get drunk again and cause problems and back they go. So they needed property to build a new state hospital, and they purposely wanted one with a ranch. And there's some more controversy with this because the guy who wrecked Camarillo then turned around the next year and bought his own property in Ventura County. And they're like, so there was an investigation to see if deals were being made, why that happened. But they picked it because of the ranch. And so they bought 1,400 acres of the 8,200 acres, right, to build the state mental hospital and to have the adjacent property so they could grow crops, right? They had a piggery, and the hospital built a dairy to provide dairy products to the mental institution. And because this was by the 1850s, this was the largest hospital, one of the largest in the state, and it was considered the largest when it was built west of the Mississippi. So by the 1850s, they had over 8,000 patients there. And then imagine all the staff, doctors, nurses, aides. So it was basically its own city. They had a laundry, right? They had a bowling alley, right? All this kind of stuff. So
1950s.
by the 1950s, it was 8,000. But it officially opened in 1936, and it was a PWA project, Public Works Administration. But the first patients were there in 1933. And where did they live? At the ranch. They lived at the ranch house. And so it has this very distinctive style, right? They call it mission style. The architects looked at Italy and Spain for influence. So this is the original part, the southern part, and then in 1941 they started the northern part. And then of course today we have also housing back there. So this is the more northern part. And today if you come to campus, this is this is where the library is today, so they tore down this front part, but we still have these ladder buildings there. Yeah, so it was very successful in that sense. By 1936, the first year of operation, next one. Okay. They had earned $8,000 in profits from selling the farm produce. So they supplied what they needed to the hospital, and then they actually sold that, which is ironic because by 1967 they sell the property, saying that it's a deficit, but they're saving some money, but that's the way it goes. So they bought it again because of here's the State Hospital farm. This was the Lewis Ranch, and the dairy, which you'll see on the next slide, is over here. That's the dairy. Yep. So they built. So that had to be put in, and today it's all in ruins. But they had the piggery, the hay barn. If you've ever heard of people refer to scary dairy out at the hospital, at the university, that's the hay barn. That's scary dairy. Yeah. So the property that I'm particularly interested in, which became CI Park, which is where they have the model airplanes, for those of you familiar there, that was sold off, the dairy and the other areas were sold off as surplus in 1973, along with most of the parcel of land that's the front entrance to the campus, which is ironic because we're turning around and getting it back now, so at least the dairy part, because it's the park. So, okay, so for me, my research areas are all about, so these are all these different activities that occurred. I didn't even talk about the sugar beets, but Ventura County is really big on sugar beets. We had a sugar beet dump there. But so my job now is trying to go around campus looking for archaeological evidence, right, for these activities. And there are other things that I don't think we can't see, squatters, oil speculators, things like that. But, so for example, this, oh shoot, it didn't work, sorry, I did that wrong. These are the past, and today it's just concrete, it's just ruins today, because they abandoned it, there we go.
So just nothing going on.
Right, well, except for the taggers.
Where is this now?
Today, it's what used to be called Camarillo Regional Park, and now we call it CI Park. It's right off of Camarillo Street and Lewis Road.
Okay.
So it's most local folks know about it because of the model airplane.
Yeah, okay, that's what I'm
Yeah.
here.
So the model airplanes are right here, right off the picture. But here's the hay barn. This was the nursery barn. This was the milking barn, and this was the bull barn. Right there.
The model airplanes, is it just for people who already own and park them and?
No,
pay
they're
them, or-
little, they're the little planes, so they broke remote control, so they come and fly them.
Huh.
Which
Oh,
the county park got turned over to us to administer, and now the days that they're allowed out there has reduced, and so they're unhappy about that. But on the other hand, I know of at least 3 fires that were started on the campus hillsides by planes crashing. So, and we,
These are all these remote,
yeah, the remote control planes.
yeah, but they have big ones outside of the booth that you could walk around and see.
Mhm. So, and I've done, this is just a map to show, I've been doing lots of different surveys on campus and finding different stuff. So, and so we're finding evidence of two sites that seem to be something, people living there or something from the 1930s and the 1940s. And then we have all these homeless, best I can say, homeless encampments post-dairy closure. Because I found a chair with a hospital inventory tag and a piece of sheet metal with a hospital inventory tag. I'm like, why would a piece of sheet metal have a tag? It's from a locker from the dairy. So the patients had lockers to put all their stuff in. But a kid's toy refrigerator, milk glass, these are special bricks used for fireplaces. And then what I call people living on the edge. So this is just a straight piece of rubber, a rubber tire. I mean, it's not a tire, it was used as a tire. And this is a wheelbarrow, but they had to fix it. These are handmade spokes. So these are people who either they're migrant farm workers or they're homeless, right, who are living on these hillsides.
So the inmates from the hospital worked on the farm?
They did, yes. They had a couple different jobs at the hospital. They could work in the laundry, right, there was various places. And not everybody got to do that. And I think for a lot of times it was the drunks and the drug addicts who were doing these things, the folks who were truly mentally ill, right,
Yeah.
didn't. And, people like to make fun and say bad things about Camarillo, but one of the things the hospital was known for was its groundbreaking work with schizophrenia. Right, so yes, there was shock treatment and lobotomies that occurred there, because all that was standard for the time. But they were also the first to really try to work with autistic kids. They actually had a school program and really trying to develop techniques for severely autistic children. But then, of course, the 80s hit with Reagan and others cutting costs, and so they phased out the hospital, and the hospital officially closed in 1997. And I think within 2 years, they rented out part of it to Cal State Northridge as a satellite campus, and we opened our doors as Cal State Channel Islands in 2002. So I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing here is that in-between period between 1967, when the dairy is closed, and eventually it becomes open space. It's sold to a nonprofit. I'm still trying to figure out which one, whether it was officially the government or what. But so then it became CI Park. So that would have been fewer people would have been out there keeping an eye on the space. And then now that it's the hospital, the university, now we have more and more people out there. But Oh, here's one of the tags. That's the chair. California State Hospital.
So you went out there and dug all this stuff up?
So all this is survey, just walking along the surface. And then I found, I took out the picture. Then here, in a survey post Springs fire on the side of a hill where there's no water foundation to the house, of a structure. I should say house because you don't know if it's domestic or not. It's 9 by 12 feet, so it's not very big. And it's made out of native rock. It's not, if it had been built as part of the hospital, it would be built with the concrete and stuff. And the hospital's built with 2 feet thick walls of concrete. And yeah, it doesn't look like this. So my research, I got sabbatical for this year, and so my research was, well, I needed something local because I have a kid in high school. I can't, go off out in Australia like I did last time. So it's like, okay, why is this building here? Who occupied it? What was going on? It's not on any hospital map that I can find. It's not in any blueprints. And we have weird things on campus like water diversion channels and walls, which I found blueprints for those. It's different than any style of campus building. And I've now found out that we owned the state owned the property until 1973. And I can't find anything definite on aerial photographs, but I'm just going to show you guys some pictures, so we'll talk about that. So, but why do I do this? Why do we care? Right? As part of an archaeologist's job, I think, is to express the history and the knowledge of people who aren't recorded in history. So the Chumash farm workers, the Japanese sugar beet farmers who leased land, right? They didn't own it, so we don't have record of these people. The migrant farm workers, the patients who are working in the dairy. So for me, part of doing the archaeology here is to try to make people aware, right, of our history and what all was occurring. And we excavate then also to try to figure out what the function is. Even though we joke in archaeology, you never know function, but can you figure out, okay, probably what activities were occurring there, right? And then when was it occupied? So my original idea, looking at the concrete and a couple jars that were dated to the 1930s, is that this was a probably Depression era structure, maybe from the Lewis Ranch. It was maybe built earlier, but you don't know. So then I had to get to work to see. So again, this is what it looked like in the fall of 2013, right after the Springs fire. This is a flashing paper, right, or dull tar paper. So had a roof. It's all gone. And we were there. Okay, sorry. This is what it looked like last summer. So between 2013 and now, we'd go survey occasionally. I had a student who did a capstone where he mapped everything on the surface, but he only collected a handful of things that he could. But here you can see mortar/concrete, right? And then we have bigger rocks that look like that wall fall, right? We only found one tiny piece of burnt wood, so I think there used to be timbers there. Fire. It's good time. I completely lost track of time. Okay, so digging last summer, in addition to my wonderful 6 students who volunteered, no pay, no credit, 2 each week, we had our resident pack rat, which was really cute at first, right? Little beady eyes, and he or she would make these cute little nests every day. And then he started tuning up the gear, and we started finding the artifacts that we hadn't yet excavated. So you leave it in one place, and we find them on the other side of the structure because he moved them as part of his nest. It's like, oh. And the other thing about archaeology is we really care about stratigraphy. You have to know where everything is. And it became clear pretty quickly we had no stratigraphy inside the house, right? It's like hoping if it had been occupied at different time periods, because that guy was churning everything up. So one part of the structure, we had 12 inches of dirt. On the other side, we had 2 or 3. So yeah, so basically I told my students, you're learning kind of real archaeology, not academic archaeology. It's like, it's kind of quick and dirty digging and not measuring everything specifically. But once we cleared off the grass, right, we were seeing artifacts just directly on the dirt or within the rocks on the floor. So here we have a cat's paw boot heel. I'm still trying to date it, but I'm thinking it's either 40s or 50s. Cat's paw became vibram soles. This is a jar lid. Here's a hinge for a door. And I should say, initially it was very odd because we were finding things on the surface, Noxema jars, a makeup brush tube, so a piano pedal, Why is there piano pedal on the side? So I have to admit, early on, we were thinking Dorothy Lewis's party house, right? No? But what was really interesting is almost immediately, as we're clearing stuff, we came across this beautiful stone pavement, stone floor. The whole floor, they took rocks and laid it down. The exception of one of this area, this right here, and we excavated more, that was blank. There are no artifacts below it. I think that might have been for some piece of equipment, right? I don't know what, stove, mechanical thing, I don't know. But this is what it looked like at the end. We removed some of the rocks to test down below, here and there. But this was the original blank area. And here's another view from the doorway. So here we turned. You're looking in. So here's the doorway right here. So you can see it right. And this is raised. This back part is slightly raised. So our first thought is the house. That's a bed area. It's kind of raised up a little bit. That didn't seem like it could be a house because we found no domestic debris. We found 2 spoons, a fork, a salt and pepper shaker, but it was filled with paint, pigment. No, 1 tin can, but it's to connect 2 pieces of pipe. That might have been like for a stove outlet or something. No tin can dumps anywhere. I looked down below, I looked around it. Does not look like it was used as a house, right? Not for living. And so if you look at kind of the artifact categories, for lack of better terms, I'm saying work industry, mechanical, a lot of mechanical stuff. Personal hygiene, so razor blades, the lipstick tubes. Painting, a lot of stuff that might be painting, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then just really miscellaneous stuff. Milwaukee's best beer can post 1984 because it's the pull tab, I mean not the pull, but the one that stays there. A couple bullet casings, right? Some kids' toys, right? So it looks like people are popping in and out, right? So.
First it sounded like a saloon, but then the kids are.
Yeah. So here's some of the artifacts. The piano pedal. Valentine's whiskey bottle, which I'm trying to date. But so lots of these little bottles. And then this, at first I thought it was a Woolworth plumbing fitting. But it turns out it was also a Woolworth electrical panel. So I showed it to actually some engineers here at the base, and they're like, oh no, that's the that connects to an electrical panel, which started my shift in thinking of what is going on here. So work-related stuff. Rubber tire from like a work cart, looks like. Pipe fittings, ferrule used for a heat exchange, that little toggle switch, and countless nails, screws, broken, some nuts, washers, bolts, what's it called? When you're drilling, I'm blanking right now, you guys are putting me on the spot.
Drill bit.
Drill bits, lots and lots of drill bits, some of them broken. I love the can, it's backwards because it's a reverse print, but it's a Hudson Motor Company, I think oil can. I'm showing my age, I didn't know originally about them. I'm like, oh, Hudson, the Hudson Hornet from Cars, right? But they went out of business in 1954. So, I'm slowly getting things that are helping me date when things were going on.
Sounds like it was a multi-purpose building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what it's looking like. So door hinges, those little fittings for tubes, and door, right, here we have the strike plate from the inside of the door, right, and then the locking mechanism. There's a lock for a cabinet. But yet then we're getting things like this. This is a handmade door hinge from a piece of sheet metal. I mean, it's clearly handmade. And we have several things like that. Somebody is using, they're reusing material. So the question is, was that done later, or was that done during the original use of the building? So clearly there's work-related stuff. Then the top left, those are all jar lids for glass bottles, and some of them are for metal. So the bottom one, that's like a paint can type, that type of lid where it's insets, but it's filled with either kind of paint or pigment or spackle or something, right, because of the white. Metal ones, plastic ones, and we have jars, broken jars, filled with what looks like pigment, and broken pieces of glass. So I have a student dating them right now. Right now the glass dates between the 1930s and the 1960s. but the majority appear to be post-1940 because of the stippling. If you ever have a glass bottle that has all those little dots on the bottom, that's post-1940. And then we're finding the little tips of paintbrushes. What I thought were paintbrushes, like the little metal part, now I'm wondering some of them if they're makeup brushes. But all the pigment suggests, so my students and I joke that one day we're gonna walk into a thrift store and we're gonna see this view on a painting, right? That maybe somebody was up there using it as an artist studio. Here's our Noxema jar. So then we have these whole personal items. So the top left, those are brooches. You can even see the, kind of hard to tell, but rhinestones, right? And the lipstick cases, the far one on the far right, cherries in the snow, number 853. Now, Revlon today still uses, I think it's Revlon, still uses cherries in the snow as a color, but it doesn't have that number, so I'm trying to figure out the date. I'm thinking early 1950s. The top one, those are two brass pieces, which I'll show in a minute, to the same tube. But then that's that Max Factor jar, which, tube, which is really interesting because it still has the theater logo. They stopped using the theater logo Max Factor in 1935 because after that they switched to Hollywood and doing movie makeup. But I think it's a brush too. And then I love this one. I don't know if anybody, I went to UCLA, so Natone distributors Lip Life. Natone became Neutrogena. And although I was in the anthropology department, I worked closely with the Coatson Institute of Archaeology at UCLA. Lloyd Coatson was a bigwig in Neutrogena. So for me, that's that little personal connection. But yeah, so those weird stuff. Makeup, brooches, right, what's going on up here. And then we have some things that I think relate to reuse, maybe later by people. So we have the boot heel. Again, that's cat's paw. I still haven't figured out the date because it's so eroded. You know, it depends on, I don't know if you guys are familiar with cat's paw, but they actually had a cat on the heel with the little paw up, but it's really worn, and so, but the style of it tells you what year possibly. But then we have a Gillette razor, safety razor, and then this thing, I can't figure out how to take it, the picture so you can see it, but it's got words all over it. It's a razor blade cover box, new pack, and so it dates to, I think, again, to the early 1950s at least, or maybe the late 40s. So people using that, we found a possible lid to a lantern with a camping lantern. And then the toys. So a truck chassis, a little, I think this is the front part of a bus. And then we found these wheels, and I was like, ooh, but these don't match. We found 3 of these. We found 3 out of 4. It's Tonka truck, and based on the style of the script, it's 1964 or earlier for the truck wheels. So what's going on here? And so now this next step is I can't find it on any of the buildings, so I thought, okay, let's go back and look at aerial photographs and stuff like this. This is a Google Earth image from recent time. So the old dairy is here. These are some water, so these ponds were put in later, and the structure is, the image, there we go, that one, that's right there. And that's a close-up of it. Gotta love Google Earth. Boom! There's the structure. Fortunately, we don't have Google Earth from
It's up on the
1936.
hill.
Yeah, it's on the ridge just over the side of the dairy. So you can't see it from the dairy, which is why I first thought it was like squatters, you know, they don't want to be seen, they're kind of hiding. There's no fresh water right there. I mean, you could go down to the creek, Cayugas Creek. If this is close to where Conejo Creek and Cayugas Creek come in. So, 1985, this was good for me because I saw those water reclamation ponds for the Camarillo Sewer District aren't there right now. So those were built later. But that pond is there. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Swamp Rats. There used to be a motor remote control boat club. This is the pond where they would do that. 1936, pre-hospital. Actually, that's wrong. That's not 1936 because the dairy would have been there already. Sorry, I got my dates wrong. That's 1932. So before they started building. But all these little houses, so the Lewis Ranch, there's something here. This is their slaughterhouse. Right, today the dairy is here. No pond, but notice the shape. Notice the shape. The structure would be somewhere right here, but it's not there. 1938, there's the dairy. But notice no paths up here, right? Again, it would be over here somewhere, but there's no paths, there's no roads, nothing. Sorry, so nothing there. 1959. The shape of the hill has changed, right? It used to be, here's the road. That looks like a quarry. And now we've got some sort of heavily trafficked path. And something maybe here, something maybe there. Kind of rectangular, that might be the structure, maybe. So, but again, there's other images. Yeah, so I went to UCSB, I looked at 100 photographs between 1927 and 2008, and I can't find it anywhere. But, you know, you get these paths, and it's like, okay, there's a reason, right, they're going up there. So, again, that's that one from 1959. So I think, right, this is a work building for that quarry, whatever was going on. It's not in any of the hospital records, so I don't know if at this point they were leasing it out, right? But it looks like from looking at other aerial photographs, this was built sometime between 1949 and 1959 is when this work was ongoing. And the vast majority of the artifacts date to the 40s and the 50s, which is what you would expect. So, I think it's a work building associated with the quarry. Subsequent use by a lot of people, right? Maybe an artist studio again. Right? I want that view. Find that artist stuff, but I don't think it's going to happen. But it's pretty clear at this point that at least, right, it wasn't associated with either the Lewis Ranch or the hospital, like not directly the hospital. So, and lots of stuff going on. I've just recently found out that the last foreman of the dairy, which closed in 1967, is still alive, but living out of state. So I'm trying to get a hold of him to talk to him to find out more. And so we're just working on the analyzing artifacts right now. And that's all I have to thank to end off my amazing crew of students, because they did this without pay or academic credit. Although they're getting academic credit now to analyze the artifacts. So I know I talked a little over, sorry, but thank you for your attention.
Awesome, thank you.
I'd like to give you a little history.
I just had a,
Oh,
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead. That's all right. Go.
Oh, when you said that perhaps a quarry,
Yeah.
do you find any artifacts from the quarry equipment and?
Not
that
so
sort of
far,
thing?
and as you saw from the picture, now what the quarry is underwater. There's a little bit of one hillside where I can go between the fence and,
Right.
yeah, so I haven't done a thorough survey down there, but,
Yeah.
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 So, but
May not be
it's
able
also
to
interesting
water.
because that building is made out of the native volcanic rock.
So they probably use,
My thought is they broke that stuff up and then used that to build the building.
A little history. I was raised in Fort Hueneme from the time I was 3 until I was 21. My mom worked and retired at Camarillo State Hospital. Mr. Broom must have been doing very well, because when I was real young, he went to Oxnard shopping, any major shopping, and there was a white Rolls Royce going down Main Street, and it's the first one I ever seen. So, somebody says that's Mr. Bart. So, I mean, Mr. Broom.
Mr. Broom.
So, yeah. And my mom said you were speaking of a lot of mental illness and alcoholics and drugs. One of the patients that was in her ward was Edward G. Robinson's daughter-in-law. And I think that's where some money came in, because my mom says she was not mentally ill at all.
Right.
But he had the money to get her committed because it was his daughter-in-law and he didn't like her. That was the rumor. Who knows?
No, and I didn't bring that up, but that's true. That's what unfortunate. I mean, women had very little control back then, and so your husband could commit you. So if you were willful, if you didn't like the way you were raising the kids, women could be committed, which is just awful. That's part of the bad history
Yeah.
of the hospital. And where I store my artifacts actually is the building with the courthouse.
That'd be nice.
Went from
For her perspective, it's bad. but-
right then. It's true. I think it's bad. Yes.
My aunt's brother was at Camarillo, I don't know exactly what years, but he suffered from maybe schizophrenia, but from mental problems after the war.
Okay.
After the Second World War, and he couldn't cope with life at that point, and so that's where he was. So I don't know how many veterans were there, but
Right, what they call shell shock right now.
yes,
It's
yes.
PTSD.
but-
So, and that reminds me, for the couple comments, we're starting an oral history program in anthropology, and so we're looking for folks to interview. So, knowing people who visited or worked at the hospital, right, or farming in the county, right, or so, one to give the students practice, and then to compile, right, a record. Because I've discovered I started this project about 10 years too late, because I keep hearing about like this one family who owned the adjacent land since 1938. They would probably definitely know about the quarry, and you know, the sons and grandsons have just all died in the last 10 years. You know, it's a
My mom, when she worked there, they rotated around as far as shifts. She would, what they call it, used to call it graveyard. And she said when the census, it was 70-something, 70-something hundred people when she worked there at the highest. And the long, long halls, you've been in a long, and she said they would have beds lined up at each side of the hall, all the way down head to tail, besides the wards. And she said she would be there all night in this little cubicle with a set of keys, and she said anytime those patients would have wanted to get the keys and go, she would have been powerless.
right.
Yeah, and geez, there was something else I was going to tell you. Oh, sorry.
It'll come
I'm
to you.
old.
It'll come to you in a minute.
What's the current enrollment of the university?
Oh, good question. Officially, our current enrollment is, I believe, with graduate students, 6,800 students. We're slowly. We had years of financial issues where we weren't allowed to grow and not hire any more faculty, so it's been fits and starts. But right now we're up. Anthropology, we have 75 students. Yay!
Any milk bottles, old milk bottles you find that's bitter?
I know, and I had one picture. I found one milk bottle with nothing on it, and I had found Chase Brothers bottles up on the hillsides, and might have been Adore, one other one, Adore, which was Rhoda.
Oh, yeah,
From
the
Malibu.
back with the name.
Adore.
Yeah, they turned it back.
Adore.
Adore, yeah. So, I have found some milk bottles, but I think the one blank one is probably from our dairy, right, that they wouldn't have. But I haven't seen any reference to whether or not we had our own logo. But I think since most of it was for hospital use, I don't think they would have, right, spent the money on that.
Do you remember the statue of the Dairy Maid? It was at Adore.
Mhm.
Now it's in the back courtyard of the county museum.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they donated or something.
Yeah, I think it's torn down.
What are the majors, the primary majors there at Channel Islands
Well,
University?
As far as population goes, the largest, of course, are psychology and business. That's the way it is, everywhere.
A lot of places.
Part of it, I struggle as an anthropologist because nobody's heard of it and their parents don't want them to major in it. But any good liberal arts education, you're getting the critical thinking skills, that you need, so you can get hired anywhere. But another really popular one is environmental science, because we have a really intensive hands-on project. They're here looking at plastics and animals, and they did the cleanup from the oil spill. They helped with that. So, but yeah, we're pretty standard majors as far as the Cal States go.
I just wondered if you had like a special thing that because of where you're located,
Well, we're trying, right? Again, we're a new university, so we're become known for our hands-on, right? So, for example, almost every semester, I take students out to the islands and do hands-on work and service learning. We volunteer in state parks and at the national park. So I think that's really what we have a lot of hands-on student research, and students get funding for research to either get projects or to go to conferences. So I think right now that's how we're kind of making our name in the Cal State system. But it's hard because we have those old established schools like Northridge and Long Beach. It's it's hard to compete with them. But I think we're doing a good job.
Find any pet milk cans? It was a milk can. It didn't need refrigeration.
Right. I'll have to.
Condensed.
I look
Yeah,
at
condensed,
we
the condensed milk,
we
yeah.
haven't done the analysis of all the metal cans yet, so that's a
Because
possibility.
back then they didn't.
Because we did. Are they rectangular?
Oh,
No, they're round.
Are they round? Okay. Well, we have some round ones and then we have some rectangular ones.
Yeah, they're about that big.
Yeah,
Oh, really?
yeah, and they were, you know, because refrigeration didn't have
Mhm.
it, so that's why they had the milk there.
So you were talking about some of the early Shumash
Okay.
history. So as part of the anthropology program, are they working with some of the other Shumash projects around the county, like the little Shumash Museum?
Yes, I mean, we have student interns who've gone to the Shumash Museum in Westlake, Thousand Oaks.
Yeah.
I've had students intern at the National Park and at the Museum of Natural County. Right, I usually bring Rodel Banuelo, Smokey, we work with him, so he'll do blessings at each of our digs. And
Right.
so yeah, I'm trying to give students an appreciation and an understanding of the importance of it, consulting with indigenous peoples, but then also local communities, right?
Right.
So a lot of times it's these Native American, but it could also be historically, right,
Yeah.
African American
Yeah.
neighborhood, or
Right.
the Japanese, if you're doing work here at the Japanese cemetery,
Right, yeah.
right, stuff like that.
Indian Joe said to say hi. He was going to come with me, but something came up. You know, he's the head of maintenance out there.
I'd probably recognize him.
Joe, yeah.
Joe. I'm not good with,
I can't pronounce his last name.
because I see people all the time when I wave and,
Sure.
I'm still learning.
Well, he
every day.
certainly knew you.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
That could be good or that could be bad. It could be, no, Colleen, archaeologist.
He's very active in the Shumash community.
Oh, okay, good. Then that's good.
I heard there's a special places for kids out
Yes, they had special wards for children.
there. Yeah.
They tore down those buildings, and that's where the university housing is now, for the faculty, staff, and Navy. But,
They use it out there too.
well, when the university was built, they did the housing because it was so expensive here in Ventura County. So the priority list is campus staff, faculty, and then neighborhood, county teachers, and Navy, right? As far as ownership of the buildings go. But then the things loosened up, it's now everybody could buy in, right? But, you know, we have a lot of Navy-based employees because it's so close here to the bases.
Okay, you mentioned the cemeteries.
Yes.
So are you guys working with those, the Japanese and the Chinese cemetery out there on
I
Pleasant Valley?
haven't yet, actually, but I do need to contact them because I have students I want to do a tombstone project, right? So I
Oh.
want them to, they can choose a cemetery to go to and do a project. Because you can do, you know, above ground archaeology by looking at tombstones.
Garcia Brothers just purchased that library, that graveyard in the back.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, they got that. Frank Nauman knows a lot about that because Nauman's owns the property right next to it.
Right.
And they did radar scans into the ground. And Frank was telling me they had to go, how many?
Was Saviors buried out there?
Yeah.
Yeah, Saviors. After Saviors Road was buried out there, and I think there's some Civil War guys out there buried.
One.
Right, 'cause
Medal of
they-
Honor guy.
Yeah, because there's the two cemeteries.
Two separate
Japanese
cemeteries.
one.
Yeah, two.
And the blank space on the
Yeah.
One
middle.
on the
Right.
corner is the Japanese or Chinese
Yeah,
cemetery.
it's
The Japanese on the front.
Yeah.
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 It was Masonic.
what was the-
Masonics owned it all.
Yeah,
What was the blank spot in the middle?
That was
Because there's a,
growing patterns.
Well, it was also, the graveyard was overgrown with ivy,
oh,
Right.
ice plant, you know.
Ice
Yeah.
plant.
Could be that they were gonna,
When I was a kid, we used to go out there at night and scare the hell out of
Oh, yeah.
each other and yell and scream. It was like bouncing through there with all the ice plants.
Frank Nauman's done a lot of work on who's out
right,
there.
I should talk about it, yeah, because I love cemeteries.
Yeah.
I need to talk to the city of Camarillo, because we're talking about redoing Dinsdale Park. That was the Pioneer Cemetery. And I saw records to high school students being paid to dig up the burials, so there could still be burials
Wow.
underneath that.
Now, where is that one at?
That's Old Town Camarillo,
Oh, okay.
just west of the chapel.
Okay.
It's called Dinsdale Park.
Well, you seen what they did to the one in Ventura.
Yeah, trash that.
They still got
Oh,
bodies.
yeah, we
there.
moved the tombstones. Of course there aren't any bodies there.
Yeah.
Tombstones went all up in
They would dug
Bald Canyon.
Hall Canyon
Yep.
and down at the river bottom.
Yep, it's the history. It happens in like in LA. Oh, we need to get oil underneath, so they drill underneath. And everybody knows about Chavez Ravine, right? Taking away the land from the owners. There was actually might have been a Jewish cemetery adjacent to it, so it's still there, but it's lots of problems there. So anyway.
Well, I'd like to thank you,
Oh.
Colleen. And
Thank
there's
you.
a little certificate for helping us out. You're always so good to us.
Of course. Thank you.
And,
As always, thanks for letting me come.
We, Johnny will be passing the hat. We usually ask for some kind of donation that helps us buy a little things.
We don't get any funding here from the city at all.
Yeah, we need better chairs in here. This big girl, I don't know.
Go down to the city council meeting and tell them, you know.
Perhaps
it-
speakers
it's-
that don't talk so long.
All right.
Yeah, Roberta and I bought all the chairs.
Yeah, all the workers here are all volunteers. None of us are paid by the city at all, so. your
And can we
donations-
get a hold of your
Thank you.
slideshow, or do you share that or no?
I usually don't share, but this one I could because
I can remember most of what I
so
saw.
I would share, but like the ones that showed where the shoe match sites are,
Got it.
I would take that out,
Got it.
but,
I think I can remember most of it.
well, no, you can send me
Yeah.
an email.
Thank you, I'm really interested, I just moved here, in the Bay Area.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
All right.
I do have
Thank
some
you.
videos here.
Thanks for
Very
coming.
good.